What is up, team? Welcome back. Welcome to week 5 of our virtual learning environment. This week, we'll be creating inequalities and learning how to take a word problem or a situation and turn it into an equation or inequality, and eventually learn how to graph those. For today's lesson, we're going to be focusing on how to make inequalities using our assignment number 1, how many of each kind, as our basis for understanding. Now, if you go back to that assignment number 1, I included a link in this week's agenda. You will see that our story starts off with two bakers, Abby and Bing Wu, and they own a small bakery that specializes in cookies, actually making cookies. Here they list out all of the ingredients needed in order to make each cookie, as well as how much preparation time they need in order to bake them. In addition, they finish off the scenario with a description of how much ingredients they actually have to work with. So I'm using all of this information as our given information in order to begin making some inequalities. So here, I wanted to start off by writing some notes in a way that is familiar with how we do it in class, some Cornell style. If you have a separate sheet of paper with you, I would take the opportunity to copy this down as we go along, and hopefully you can use it as you move forward in creating your own inequalities. Here, you will see that we have the given information of the problem, which means we have 110 pounds of cookie dough, 32 pounds of icing, 140 dozen cookies in an oven, the oven space, and 15 hours of cooking time. The types of cookies we can make are plain cookies or iced cookies, and below are listed ingredients and prep time for each of them. Remember, when we're talking about cookies, we're talking about dozens of cookies. Sorry for the handwriting. This is a new software that I'm trying to use. We're talking about dozens of cookies. Here, we don't need to know how many individual cookies we can make because all we care about is how many dozen we actually can put out. Remember, bakeries, they don't really count individual cookies that come out of their store. They count how many batches of dozens they make in order to make a profit. Here, we're going to be using the information given and dozens of cookies and what is needed to make each type of cookie in order for us to create our first inequality. So here, I'm going to go ahead and write creating inequalities from a word problem. And if you remember, word problems in our case are going to be called situations. Now, to help understand how to make a inequality from a word problem, I'm going to list out some steps. There's actually 3 main steps that we're going to follow that hopefully can get you to a point of understanding so you can make your own inequalities with another type of word problem. Off in the margin, I'm just going to write the word steps. And you can write down these steps too in order to help you understand how to make your own inequality. The first step that we're going to be taking in order to make an inequality, step number 1, is going to be identifying the constraints. Now, if you remember from the first unit, Overland Trail, a constraint is essentially a condition in which you have to have come true within the given problem. In this case, when we start identifying constraints, what we're going to be doing is identifying the number of inequality equations or inequalities that we need to write for the given problem. So each constraint is going to be one inequality. So the number of constraints is going to equal the number of inequalities needed. In this problem, we actually have 4 constraints. We need to have 110 pounds of cookie dough, 32 pounds of icing, 140 dozen cookies can fit in the oven, and we have 15 hours of cooking time. We can't go over any of these values. These are the 4 constraints that we have. So for step 1 here, what we're going to do is identify them and split them up so that way we can get a better idea of what a constraint is and we can organize our information to write an inequality for that constraint. So the first constraint that we have, we'll put a little dot here, is going to be cookie dough. A second constraint that we have is going to be icing. A third constraint that we have is going to be oven space. And the last one, the fourth one, is going to be cooking time, or in this case, we can call it preparation time. And from here, we're going to use each of these constraints and make an equation for each of them, or an inequality for each of them. So step one, if you can identify the constraints, you're already halfway there. Now, step two is going to be a little bit different. And for step two, I'm going to use red. So hopefully you can see it a little bit better. Step two is to actually go through each constraint and express each constraint in words. Which means take each constraint and talk to me about it as if you're talking to a normal person about what you have to do. So imagine that you have the two bakers talking about cookie dough. What needs to be true with the amount of cookie dough? Here, you want to focus on making sense of the problem. Sometimes when we start making inequalities, students get really caught up in trying to make the perfect inequality. They forget of what the inequality actually represents. So here, we're going to start with taking one of these constraints and making sense of what needs to be true with it. So I'm going to put another arrow here. This time we're on step two. I'm going to do it in red. Cookie dough. What needs to be true for cookie dough? Well, in terms of the problem with Abby and Bing Wu, they had to use cookie dough in order to make both a plain cookie and an iced cookie. Here, you'll see that we need 1 pound of cookie dough per dozen plain cookies and 0.7 pounds of cookie dough per dozen iced cookies. So here, we can get plain cookies and the dough that they need, plus iced cookies and the amount of dough that they need. And according to the constraint up here, I'm going to put another star. According to the constraint up here, plain cookies and the dough that we need for them, plus the iced cookies and the dough that we need for them, has to be less than or equal to 110 pounds of dough. Oh. Now, how did we get this less than or equal to piece? Well, if we think about it, if Abby and Bing Wu only have 110 pounds of cookie dough, you can't make any more cookies than that. That's your limit. And here, we actually can use up all 110 pounds of cookie dough, or we could find ourselves using less. So we're going to be using less than or equal to 110 pounds of dough. We can write a similar sentence or expression in words for each of the other constraints following suit with what we did for the cookie dough in the first constraint. So for icing, we get plain cookies, icing, plus the iced cookies icing, that also needs to be less than or equal to a certain amount, which in this case, if we look up here, 32 pounds of icing. So here we have two different sentences, one for each of these constraints. We can do the same for each of the others, and you'll get something that looks like this. Plain cookies, oh, plus just iced cookies has to be less than or equal to 140 dozen. I got 140 dozen from the third constraint up here. Finally, time, plain cookies, and their prep time, plus the amount of time used for iced cookies, prep time, that also needs to be less than or equal to a certain amount, which in this case is 15 hours. Here, less than or equal to seems to be the case for all of these because we don't want to use more than 110 pounds of cookie dough because we don't have any. We can't use more than 32 pounds of icing. You can't fill up the oven with more than 140 dozen cookies. And we only have 15 hours of cooking time, which means we have to be either less than that or exactly that in order for us to make our mark. Here, you see this is a lot of stuff to write out in words. But if you get used to doing this in your head and putting it on paper, you'll get a better idea of how to actually create the inequality when it comes down to actually writing it out. Step 3. Step 3 is actually the part where we can start taking everything we know here and replacing it with variables, numbers, and symbols. Here is going to be express it. Express constraints using numbers, variables, and symbols. In this case, I'm actually going to take each of these constraints and I'm going to rewrite them underneath so that way we can see all of this again just a little bit differently. So, for example, the first constraint that we have, once again, I'm going to put a little bullet point. We have cookie dough. Now, if we look above, our plain cookies and iced cookies end up adding together, summing the amount of dough that they use in order to equal less than or equal to 110 pounds of cookie dough. So in this case, what we need to do is we need to discover what can we use to represent a plain cookie? What variable can we use to represent a plain cookie? Also, what can we use to represent an iced cookie? If you remember, a variable is something that can change. It's a value that is always changing. In this case, the bakery, they can always change the amount of cookies that they make, the amount of plain cookies and the amount of iced cookies. For the purpose of this problem, I'm going to refer to a plain cookie as the variable p, and an iced cookie as a variable I. I'm going to do a little cursive I. So cookie dough. Let's look. We're going to be doing P for plain cookies. We know what plus means. I for iced cookies is less than or equal to. If you go back to your cheat sheet and you take a look at the stuff that we learned last week or the week before spring break, you'll see that less than or equal to has a symbol that looks like this. 110 pounds of dough. Now, this is great, but we have one problem. This is adding the number of plain cookies and the number of iced cookies together. That's great, but where is this information where we talk about the amount of dough for plain cookies and the amount of dough for iced cookies? We need to use these numbers somewhere in here in order to help us understand this problem. So here, we need to figure out how much dough is needed for each plain cookie. If I look up here, it says 1 pound. Iced cookies, I need 0.7 pounds. So in front of the P, we're going to be using 1 pound of cookie dough per plain cookie. And here we're going to be using 0.7 pounds of cookie dough for each iced cookie. For the sake of this problem, you can write below this, let me undo that line. for the sake of this problem, you can write underneath it a sentence that may help you a little bit. 1 pound of dough per dozen plain cookies. Here, this represents 0.7 pounds of dough per dozen iced cookies. This may help you see how you can organize these inequalities a little bit better in order to get a good understanding of what it is we're doing. I'm going to slide up the screen. Let's do the next couple problems together and see if we get a good understanding of it. Switch black. Switch to the black. Come over here, extend this a little bit. Here we have cookie dough. The next constraint that we have is going to be icing. We have a similar problem as of before because with icing, we did the same thing. We just said plain cookies plus ice cookies is less than or equal to 32 pounds. Here, if we wrote that, we get P plus I again is less than or equal to 32 pounds. But like before, this is just adding together the number of plain cookies and the number of ice cookies. We need to use up icing. So in order for us to use icing, we have to go back to the given information above and determine how much we actually used. In this case, you'll see that we used no icing, 0 pounds per dozen of plain cookies, and 0.4 pounds of icing per dozen iced cookies. So for this problem down below, although you don't need it, you can write 0 representing the amount of icing I used for a plain cookie, and 0.4 pounds of icing that I used per dozen iced cookies. When you're writing this again for step 4, for the fourth step of this, you can actually simplify this down to be just 0p, or technically you don't need it because we're not using any icing for any plain cookies. Let's keep going. The third constraint that we have is going to be oven space. Here, oven space is the number of plain cookies plus the number of iced cookies. Ovens don't really have a special thing that we're using up, it's just space. So in this case, the P plus I that we used earlier will actually be the equation representing the amount of oven space. The number of plain cookies that we use plus the number of ice cookies that we use has to be less than or equal to 140 dozen, because that's the total amount that can fit into the oven. The final constraint is going to be time. Time, we follow the same process as before. It's the number of plain cookies plus the number of iced cookies is less than or equal to, in this case, 15 hours, because we have 15 hours to prepare our plain and iced cookies. But similar to the amount of icing and the amount of dough that we used, we need to figure out how much time do we need per plain cookie and how much time do we need per iced cookie. In this case, if we look above, we see that we need 0.01 hours of prep for a plain cookie and 0.015 hours of prep for an iced cookie. So I could put down here 0.1 hours per plain cookie plus 0.15. Oh, let me rewrite this guy. Plus 0.15 hours per iced cookie. Now, this is great. It looks awesome so far, but it's still a little bit scattered. I want to make sure that we are actually representing this the best way we can. So for that, I'm going to go ahead and scroll down. Our step 4 for this problem is going to be rewrite the inequalities. This step may seem tedious to some of us because you may say to yourself, hey, Hernandez, I got them all. I know exactly what to do. But without rewriting them, sometimes you may miss something that you didn't know you missed, and you can find it here when you rewrite it. So we have 4 constraints to the homework assignment, the first homework assignment. I'm going to go ahead and write them out here. The first one is cookie dough. The second one is icing. The third one is going to be oven space. And the fourth is going to be time, preparation time. Here, you can actually rewrite the constraints that we wrote above and make it a little bit neater. For cookie dough, the inequality that we have is going to be 1p, or just p, plus 0.7i is less than or equal to 110. For icing, we have 0p. For this problem, I'm going to keep it as 0, plus 0.4i is less than or equal to 32 pounds. Oven space, p plus I, less than or equal to 140 dozen. And time, 0.1 p plus 0.15 I is less than or equal to 15. Now, a good rule of thumb, before you finish the problem and you say, I'm done, make sure you go back and you put some units in here so that way we know exactly what we're talking about. For cookie dough, we're talking about pounds of dough. For icing, we're talking about pounds of icing. For oven space, we're talking about the total number of cookies in dozens. Remember, we're talking about dozens of cookies. And the last one, time, we're talking about hours of prep time. Okay. In this case, we have successfully created 4 inequalities for the 4 constraints that we have of the homework assignment number 1. If we take a look again at everything that we did, I'm going to zoom out here, you'll see that we ended up taking the given information of the problem, dissected it a little bit, pulled apart the 4 inequalities that we have listed, wrote down what each inequality is made out of, and then we went ahead and expressed the constraints using variables and numbers given the information above. Hopefully these steps will help you through the practice as well as moving forward into your homework assignment for this week. It's called Healthy Animals, and you'll be able to make your own inequalities by the end of this week. Good luck. I'll see you during our virtual lessons, and I'll see you next time.